I think I might actually buy this place, I said, standing on the weathered deck of the Cape Cod beach house, salt air whipping my hair across my face as I looked out at the Atlantic stretching endlessly before me. The words came out quieter than I intended, almost lost in the sound of the waves, but not quiet enough. My mother's laugh came first, that particular trill she reserved for things she found absurd, followed immediately by my sister Rachel's sharper, more cutting version of the same sound. And then David, my brother-in-law, joined in with his booming guffaw that made the elderly realtor standing near the door shift uncomfortably. "Oh, Emma," my mother said, still chuckling as she exchanged glances with Rachel. That familiar look passing between them that I'd seen my entire 32 years of life. The one that said, "Isn't she precious? Isn't she naive? Isn't she just adorably delusional?" That's sweet, honey, really. But this house is listed at $2.8 million. This isn't like renting an apartment. Rachel draped her arm over David's shoulder, her diamond engagement ring catching the afternoon sunlight, and she smiled at me with something that might have looked like affection to a stranger, but that I recognized as pity mixed with condescension. "Emma, come on, let's be realistic here. David and I have been looking at properties in this range, and even with both our incomes and mom and dad helping with the down payment, it's a stretch. You're sweet to dream, but you work from home doing, what is it again? Computer stuff?" She said it like I'd told her I made friendship bracelets for a living. I stood there looking at the three of them, my family, the people who were supposed to know me best in the world, and I felt that old familiar weight settling in my chest, the one that had been there since childhood, since the first time I brought home straight A's, and they asked why I wasn't more social like Rachel, since the first time I won a science fair, and they were too busy at Rachel's soccer game to attend the ceremony. My father had stayed home in Boston for a work call, but I could imagine his reaction would have been the same measured disappointment, disguised as pragmatism, that colored most of our interactions. I worked in tech, yes, remotely from my small apartment in San Francisco, and I'd been deliberately vague about the details for the past 5 years, because every time I'd tried to share anything about my life, my achievements, my career, the conversation somehow circled back to Rachel's latest promotion to senior marketing coordinator, or her wedding plans, or her new car, or her beautiful home in the suburbs. They assumed I was struggling. They assumed I was barely making rent. They assumed that my modest lifestyle, my old Honda Civic, my simple clothes, my lack of social media presence showcasing luxury meant failure rather than choice. And I'd let them assume it because somewhere deep down, I'd been testing something, waiting to see if anyone would value me for who I was, rather than what I had, waiting to see if anyone would ask about my life with genuine interest, rather than obligatory politeness, before redirecting to Rachel's accomplishments. The pattern had been established so long ago that I could barely remember a time when things were different, when my accomplishments were met with genuine pride instead of polite dismissal, followed by a swift redirect to Rachel's achievements. I remembered family dinners over the past 5 years, the ones I'd flown back to Boston for, spending $600 on last-minute flights because they'd scheduled gatherings with 2 weeks' notice, sitting at my parents' dining room table while Rachel held court about her promotion to senior marketing coordinator at a mid-sized firm, a position that came with a $72,000 salary that my mother praised as if Rachel had been named CEO of a Fortune 500 company. "We're just so proud," my mother would say, squeezing Rachel's hand while my father nodded approvingly. And when the attention occasionally drifted to me, when someone remembered to ask what I was up to, I'd barely get 3 sentences about a successful product launch or a complex system architecture I'd designed before Rachel would jump in with a story about landing a new client or organizing a successful company retreat. I'd paid my own way through MIT, every single dollar of that $240,000 education, working internships and part-time jobs, and taking out loans that I'd spent the first 3 years after graduation aggressively paying down while living in a studio apartment that cost $2,400 a month in San Francisco, eating ramen and rice and beans, building my career from the ground up. Rachel's education at a state school, A perfectly good education that cost $96,000 for 4 years had been entirely funded by our parents, and her wedding to David 3 years ago, that elaborate affair with 200 guests at a vineyard, that $85,000 celebration, had also been bankrolled by Mom and Dad, while I'd received a card on my 30th birthday with $50 inside and a note saying they hoped I'd treat myself to something nice. I'd moved to San Francisco 5 years ago, right after landing my first major tech position, and in those 5 years I'd called home every other week, visited 4 times a year, sent Christmas gifts and birthday presents, and endured the casual assumptions that permeated every conversation, the way my mother would ask if I was eating enough with genuine concern in her voice, as if I might be starving. The way my father would mention job openings at Boston companies as if I needed rescuing from my California failure, the way Rachel would offer to send me her hand-me-down clothes or furniture with the kindness of someone helping a struggling younger sibling. They saw my 12-year-old Honda Civic and assumed poverty rather than recognizing that I took public transit most days and didn't need a new car. They saw my simple wardrobe from Target and Uniqlo and assumed I couldn't afford better, rather than understanding that I'd rather invest my money than waste it on luxury brands. They saw my small apartment and assumed it was all I could afford, rather than knowing it was a conscious choice to save aggressively while working towards specific financial goals. Every assumption built on the last, creating this elaborate fiction of Emma, the struggling techie. Emma, who worked from home in her pajamas doing some vague computer thing they didn't understand and probably didn't pay well. Emma, who would probably need their help someday. Emma, who was nothing like successful, put-together Rachel, with her corporate job and her husband and her house in the suburbs. The beach house on Cape Cod had been a fixture of my childhood summers. Those 2 weeks every August when we'd pack into the car and drive to this exact stretch of coastline, renting various properties over the years. But this particular house, this gray-shingled cottage with white trim, and that expansive deck overlooking the beach, this had been our spot for 5 consecutive summers when I was between the ages of 7 and 11, before the owners stopped renting it out to focus on their own family visits. I remembered every corner of this place, the way the screen door slammed with a particular creak and bang that signaled someone going down to the beach, the outdoor shower with the weathered wooden slats where you'd rinse off the sand and salt, the kitchen with the blue tile backsplash where my mother would make pancakes on Saturday mornings, while Rachel and I fought over who got to add the blueberries, the bedroom on the second floor that I'd claimed as mine with the window seat where I'd spent hours reading while listening to the waves, the only place in my childhood where I'd felt completely at peace, because somehow here, away from school and neighbors and my parents' friends, the comparisons between Rachel and me seemed to matter less. Those summers had been before Rachel became the golden child in earnest, before her social success and my academic focus created the diverging paths that would define our relationship, back when we were just sisters who built sandcastles and hunted for hermit crabs and fell asleep to the sound of the ocean. When I'd heard the house was for sale, listed at $2.8 million by the elderly couple who'd owned it for 40 years and were finally downsizing to a retirement community in Florida, I'd felt something shift in my chest. A recognition that this place represented something more than just nostalgia. It represented the last time I'd felt truly accepted by my family, without conditions or comparisons. Rachel and David had been talking openly during the entire viewing about how they were planning to buy it, how they'd already discussed it with Mom and Dad who'd agreed to help with the down payment. Maybe $400,000 they'd suggested, and David's parents might contribute another $200,000, and they'd calculated they could manage the mortgage on the remaining $2.2 million if they stretched their budget, and David's startup finally got its second round of funding. My mother had been measuring windows for curtains she was already planning, talking about which bedrooms she and Dad would take for their summer visits, and Rachel was photographing every room for her Pinterest board of renovation ideas, and I'd stood there on that deck looking at the water and thought about how this was the only place I'd ever felt like I belonged. And the words had come out before I could stop them, that quiet statement about buying it myself, and the laughter that followed had cut deeper than they could have known. My mother's follow-up comment, delivered with that particular blend of condescension and concern. "Sweetheart, this isn't a studio apartment in a bad neighborhood," had hung in the salt air like an indictment of everything they believed about my life, and I'd felt my jaw tighten and my hands clench at my sides. But I'd said nothing, just nodded and smiled and let them continue their planning, while inside I made a very different plan, one they'd never see coming. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, because I'd been so careful to keep this part of my life entirely separate from them, was that I was a senior software engineer at a major tech company in San Francisco, that my base salary was $450,000 per year, with annual bonuses that typically added another $80,000 to $100,000, that my stock options and equity grants over the past 4 years had vested to a value of approximately $1.8 million, that I'd been living on less than $60,000 a year while investing and saving everything else with an almost obsessive discipline that my financial advisor, Rebecca, had called both impressive and slightly concerning until she understood what I was saving for. I joined the company 4 years ago after 3 years at a smaller startup where I'd earned a modest $120,000 and learned to live on even less. And in those 4 years, I'd watched my net worth climb from $340,000 to its current level of $3.2 million through a combination of aggressive saving, smart investing in index funds, and real estate investment trusts, and the explosive growth of my company's stock price, which had tripled since I'd joined. I lived in a rent-controlled studio apartment in the Sunset District that cost me $1,800 a month. When I could easily afford a luxury high-rise downtown, I drove that 12-year-old Honda Civic when I could pay cash for a Tesla. I bought my clothes at Target and Uniqlo when I had enough money in my checking account at any given moment to walk into Nordstrom and buy their entire window display. And I did all of this because I'd learned early in my career what happened when people knew you had money. I'd learned it from a colleague who'd made the mistake of mentioning his stock windfall and suddenly found himself flooded with requests from family members who needed help with rent, with car payments, with credit card debt, with down payments, with endless emergencies that somehow always required exactly as much money as they thought he could afford to give. I'd been planning to buy the beach house for 2 years, ever since I'd driven up to Cape Cod on a solo trip and seen it still standing there, still beautiful, still holding all those memories of the only time my family had felt like a safe place. And I'd researched the owners and learned they were in their 80s and would likely sell soon, and I'd structured my finances specifically around being able to make an all-cash offer if necessary, though Rebecca had advised that taking a mortgage at current interest rates made more sense given my investment returns. The secrecy had started as a practical measure, a way to avoid the inevitable requests for money and the complicated dynamics that come with being the family member who has resources when everyone assumes you don't. But it had evolved into something else over the years, a test, perhaps. A way of knowing whether my family loved me for who I was or only for what I could provide. And year after year, they'd failed that test without even knowing they were taking it. They'd dismissed my achievements and ignored my worth, and made me feel small while I sat at their dinner table knowing I earned 6 times what Rachel made and had a net worth that exceeded what my parents had accumulated in 40 years of dual-income professional careers. I told myself I kept quiet because it was easier, because it avoided conflict, because some part of me didn't want to change the dynamic. But standing on that deck listening to them laugh at the very idea that I could buy the house, I'd finally admitted to myself what I'd known all along, that I'd been waiting for them to see me, really see me, without the resume and the bank statements, and they never had. I drove back to San Francisco the next morning, my mind churning with a question I'd been avoiding for years: whether I should finally tell them the truth about my life, my career, my financial success, and let them see who I'd actually become, or whether I should simply continue in this strange shadow existence where they believed I was struggling while I quietly built a life beyond anything they'd imagined for me. Part of me wanted vindication, wanted to see their faces when they realized how wrong they'd been, how completely they'd misjudged me, how all their dismissive comments and pitying looks had been based on assumptions they'd never bothered to verify. But another part of me, the part that had kept this secret for so long, wondered what would actually change if they knew, whether they'd love me differently or just start seeing me as a resource, an ATM for their own struggles and dreams. I remembered the times I had tried to share my achievements with them, small attempts that had been dismissed or overshadowed before I'd learned to stop trying. When I'd gotten my first software engineering job at 24, making $85,000 a year, more than either of my parents had earned at that age, I'd called home excited to share the news, and my mother had said, "That's nice, dear," and then spent 20 minutes talking about Rachel's promotion to senior marketing coordinator at her nonprofit, a role that paid $52,000 and came with a new title on her business cards. When I'd been accepted into the highly selective engineering program that led to my current position, a program with a 4% acceptance rate that companies recruited from aggressively, I'd mentioned it at Sunday dinner, and my father had nodded absently and then asked Rachel about her new boyfriend who worked in finance. Wasn't that impressive? Finance was where the real money was. When my startup had been acquired and I'd received my first significant stock payout, $180,000 that had felt like winning the lottery, I'd started to tell them during Thanksgiving dinner, and Rachel had interrupted to announce her engagement. And the rest of the evening had dissolved into wedding planning while I'd sat there with my news still unspoken, already forgotten. I'd learned that my achievements existed in a separate category from Rachel's, that hers were real and mine were somehow theoretical, that her middle-class markers of success, the boyfriend, the engagement, the wedding, the house in the suburbs, were more comprehensible and therefore more valuable than my abstract world of software and stock options and remote work that let me live anywhere but kept me somehow invisible. The final straw came 3 days after the beach house viewing, when I'd driven to my parents' house to drop off some items my mother had asked to borrow, and I'd arrived early, let myself in with my key, and heard Rachel and David in the kitchen talking with my parents. Rachel's voice had carried clearly through the hallway. "I just worry about Emma, you know. She's going to be 33 next month and she has nothing to show for it. No husband, no house, that awful apartment, whatever job she does on her computer that she never talks about. She's the family disappointment, and honestly, I think we need to prepare ourselves that David and I will probably need to support her eventually when she can't make rent or has some emergency." It's sad, really. The words had hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel exactly, but because they were said with such casual certainty, such complete conviction, that this was simply the truth of who I was. My mother's response had been worse. "I know, honey. Your father and I have been setting aside a little money, just in case Emma needs help. We don't want her to be homeless or desperate. She tries, but some people just don't have what it takes to really succeed." I'd stood there in the hallway, frozen, listening to them discuss my inevitable failure with the same tone they might use to discuss a chronic illness or a struggling child, with pity and resignation and the weary acceptance of a burden they'd have to carry. I'd set the items down silently and left without announcing my presence, and I'd driven back to my studio apartment, my modest rent-controlled studio that I could buy outright with 3 months of my salary, and I'd sat on my second-hand couch in front of my old television, and I'd made my decision. I called Rebecca that afternoon, my financial advisor who'd been helping me plan for this purchase for 2 years, and I said, "I want to move forward on the beach house. Now." She'd asked if I was sure, if I wanted to wait until the property was officially listed, if I wanted to look at other options, and I told her no, I wanted this house, this specific house, and I wanted to buy it immediately. Within 2 hours, she'd connected me with a mortgage broker who'd pulled my financial records and pre-approved me for $3 million, far more than I needed. And though I could have bought the house outright with cash and still had $400,000 left over, Rebecca had reminded me that with mortgage rates at 3.2% and my investment portfolio returning an average of 9%, it made more financial sense to take the loan and keep my capital invested. Advice I accepted because it was sound, even though part of me wanted the symbolic satisfaction of writing a single check for $2.8 million. That evening, I found the realtor's information online, a woman named Karen Foster, who specialized in high-end coastal properties, and I sent her an email introducing myself, expressing serious interest in the Cape Cod property, and requesting a private meeting to discuss making an offer, and I emphasized private, making it clear I didn't want this information shared with anyone, especially not with other potential buyers who might be considering the same property. Karen responded to my email within 3 hours, her message professional and warm, suggesting we meet at her office in Hyannis the following Tuesday, and I took 2 days off work, telling my manager I had personal business on the East Coast, which was true enough even if it didn't capture the full weight of what I was doing. I flew into Boston on Monday evening, rented a car, and drove to Cape Cod, checking into a modest hotel in Dennis, where I spent the night rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd present myself, wondering if Karen would take me seriously or if she'd see a young woman in jeans and a sweater and make the same assumptions my family had made for years. Tuesday morning, I dressed carefully, business casual but polished, and I brought my leather portfolio containing my pre-approval letter, my bank statements showing liquid assets, my investment account summaries, everything that proved I was a serious buyer with serious resources. And when I walked into Karen's office at exactly 10 o'clock, she greeted me with a firm handshake and an appraising look that felt different from my family's dismissive glances, more curious than judgmental. We sat in her conference room with its view of the harbor, and I explained that I was interested in the Cape Cod property, that I'd spent summers there as a child when my family had rented it, that I wanted to make a competitive offer, and I slid my pre-approval letter across the table, watching her eyes widen slightly as she read the approved amount of $3 million. "You're pre-approved for well above the asking price," she said, looking up at me with new attention, and I nodded, explaining that I wanted to offer the full asking price of $2.8 million, with proof of funds, minimal contingencies, and the fastest possible closing timeline, 30 days if the sellers could accommodate it, and I was willing to be flexible on their timing for moving out. They could have 60 days post-closing if they needed it. Karen was quiet for a moment, studying me with the kind of professional assessment that comes from years of reading buyers, and then she said, "May I ask what you do, Emma? I don't mean to be intrusive, but in my experience, buyers your age at this price point are usually tech entrepreneurs or cryptocurrency investors, and it helps me represent you better if I understand your situation." I appreciated her directness, and I told her I was a senior software engineer at a major tech company, that I'd been saving and investing specifically for this purchase, that I was financially stable, and this wasn't a stretch for me, and something in my tone must have convinced her, because she smiled and said, "Well, you're certainly the most prepared 32-year-old buyer I've worked with. Let me call the seller's agent right now." She made the call while I sat there, my heart pounding despite my outward calm, and I listened to her pitch my offer with professional enthusiasm, emphasizing the full price offer, the strong pre-approval, the quick close, the flexibility on possession date. And when she hung up 15 minutes later, she was smiling. "They want to see the proof of funds and pre-approval in writing, but their agent says if everything checks out as you've represented, they're inclined to accept. The sellers are both 84, they're moving to assisted living, and they want this wrapped up quickly and cleanly. You should have an answer by tomorrow morning." I left her office feeling simultaneously elated and terrified, the reality of what I was doing finally hitting me fully, and I drove back to Boston, flew home to San Francisco, and spent Wednesday working from my apartment while obsessively checking my email until Karen's message arrived at 2:30 Pacific Time. "Offer accepted. Congratulations, Emma. Let's get you to closing." The next 3 weeks passed in a strange duality where I moved through the inspection process, the appraisal, the title search, the endless paperwork of buying a $2.8 million property, while simultaneously attending family dinners where Rachel and David discussed their plans to pursue the same house, completely unaware that it was already mine, that every document I signed brought me closer to owning the place they believed would be theirs. The inspection happened on a Tuesday, and I flew out to meet the inspector, a thorough man in his 60s who spent 4 hours examining every corner of the house and ultimately reported that it was in excellent condition, the roof only 5 years old, the HVAC system recently updated, the foundations solid, nothing that would prevent the sale from moving forward. And I stood in the empty living room where I'd spent so many childhood summers and felt the surreal weight of the fact that this would soon be mine. The appraisal came in at $285 million, slightly above my purchase price, which meant the mortgage would proceed without issue, and Karen called me with unconcealed excitement in her voice, saying that everything was falling into place beautifully, that the sellers were thrilled with how smoothly the process was going, that we were on track for closing in exactly 1 week. That Saturday, I drove to my parents' house for what had been described as a family planning meeting. And when I arrived, Rachel and David were already there, spread out at the dining room table with their laptop open and a notepad covered in calculations. And my mother greeted me with a distracted kiss on the cheek before saying, "Oh, good, Emma, you're here. We need to discuss something important as a family." We sat around the table, my father at the head with his reading glasses on, and Rachel launched into an announcement that she and David had decided to seriously pursue the Cape Cod beach house, that they'd been working with a mortgage broker and believed they could get approved for $2 million, that they'd need my parents to co-sign and contribute approximately $400,000 for the down payment and closing costs, and that they wanted to make an offer within the next 2 weeks before someone else snatched it up. My mother's face was bright with excitement, already talking about how wonderful it would be to keep the house in the family, how she'd always dreamed of having a place on the Cape where we could all gather for holidays and summers, how Rachel and David were so responsible and this was such a smart investment. My father was more cautious, pulling out his own calculator and running numbers, asking about their income and debts and what their monthly payment would be. But even his skepticism was wrapped in a fundamental acceptance that this plan was real and feasible, and that if the numbers worked, they'd make it happen. Then Rachel turned to me with a pointed look and said, "We were hoping you'd want to contribute something too, Emma. Maybe $20,000 or $30,000 toward the down payment so it could be a true family purchase, something we all own together." And the table went quiet as they all looked at me expectantly, waiting for my answer. I felt the weight of the signed purchase agreement sitting in my email inbox, the closing scheduled for exactly 6 days from now, the wire transfer already arranged with my bank, and I said calmly, "I appreciate you thinking of me, but I'm going to have to decline. I have my own plans for my money." The reaction was immediate, and exactly what I'd expected. Rachel's face flushed with irritation. My mother's expression shifted to disappointment. My father frowned and said, "What plans, Emma? This is a family investment." And Rachel added with barely concealed frustration, "Of course you won't help. You never think about anyone but yourself." I met her eyes and said, "I think about myself enough to have plans, yes." And David laughed, actually laughed, and said, "What plans could you possibly have that are more important than helping your family?" I sipped my water and said simply, "My own plans," and let the silence stretch, knowing that in less than a week, every assumption they were making would shatter, and I'd finally stop being invisible. Rachel's frustration in the days that followed became impossible to ignore, manifesting in a series of pointed text messages and phone calls where she alternated between guilt-tripping and outright accusations, telling me that I was being selfish and short-sighted, that family was supposed to support each other in major investments, that my refusal to contribute even a small amount proved I'd never cared about being part of the family unit, and each message revealed more about her financial situation than she probably intended to share. During a particularly tense phone call 3 days before my closing, she admitted that she and David had been carrying significant credit card debt, approximately $45,000 spread across multiple cards, the result of what she called maintaining their lifestyle in their expensive Boston suburb, the same lifestyle she'd always presented as effortless success during family dinners, where she talked about their renovated kitchen and their luxury car leases and their weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard. She explained with rising defensiveness that their mortgage pre-approval for $2 million was contingent on my parents co-signing and providing the down payment because their debt-to-income ratio was too high otherwise, and that David's tech startup, the one he'd been working on for 3 years while she supported them, hadn't gained the traction they'd expected and was essentially operating at a loss, surviving on the small amount of angel investor funding he'd secured and his part-time consulting work. I listened in silence, remembering the times I'd needed help and received none, thinking about how I'd paid for my own college education with scholarships and part-time jobs, while Rachel had received full parental funding, how I'd worked 3 jobs the summer after graduation, while Rachel had taken an unpaid internship that my parents had subsidized with monthly checks. How when I'd asked to borrow $2,000 7 years ago for an emergency root canal before my dental insurance kicked in at my new job, my mother had said they couldn't spare it, but had somehow found $30,000 for Rachel's wedding 6 months later. Rachel's voice on the phone took on a pleading quality as she said, "Emma, we really need this. It's not just about having a beach house. It's an investment that could set us up financially. And if you could just help with $30,000, it would make the down payment so much more manageable." And I felt the familiar pull of family obligation warring with the newer, stronger instinct for self-preservation. My mother had called separately that same evening, her tone gentle but laden with expectation, saying, "Emma, sweetheart, I know you've always been independent, but family means supporting each other, and Rachel and David are in a position where they could really use your help. We all have to help each other in life." And I'd responded calmly, "I agree, Mom. Family should support each other," letting the irony hang in the air between us, knowing she wouldn't catch it, knowing that in 72 hours everything would change and they'd finally understand exactly how much support I'd managed without. The closing was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I told my family I had a doctor's appointment, keeping my voice casual when my mother called that morning asking if I could help her with some errands later, saying I'd be tied up most of the day, but would let her know when I was free. I drove to the title company's office in downtown Boston wearing a navy blazer and the pearl earrings my grandmother had left me, feeling the weight of the moment settling into my bones as I walked into the conference room, where Karen was already waiting with the sellers, an elderly couple named Margaret and Harold, who had owned the beach house for 43 years and were moving to a retirement community in Florida, their faces kind and weathered as they shook my hand. The closing took 90 minutes, a procession of documents that I signed with steady hands while the title attorney explained each one, the mortgage paperwork, and the deed and the transfer documents, and the settlement statement, showing exactly where every dollar of the $2.8 million was going. And when I signed the final page and the attorney said, "Congratulations, Ms. Richardson, you're now the owner of 247 Ocean View Drive," I felt something break open in my chest, a knot of tension I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. Karen handed me 2 sets of keys with a smile that was genuinely warm and said, "Emma, I have to tell you, in 20 years of doing this, it's rare to see someone your age in such a strong financial position. You should be incredibly proud of yourself." And Margaret reached across the table to squeeze my hand, saying, "Take good care of our house, dear. I can tell it's going to a good home." I drove directly to the Cape, taking the 2-hour route with my hands tight on the steering wheel and my heart hammering against my ribs. And when I pulled into the driveway and used my own key to open the front door, I stepped into the silent house and felt the enormity of what I'd done wash over me like a wave. I walked through every room slowly, trailing my fingers along the walls, standing in the master bedroom with its view of the ocean, sitting on the window seat in what used to be my childhood bedroom where I'd spent so many summers reading and watching the water. And I cried, actually cried, Not from sadness, but from the pure, overwhelming reality that this was mine. That I'd done this entirely on my own. That every dismissive comment and every laughed-off achievement and every moment of being treated as less than had led to this moment where I stood in a $2.8 million house that belonged to me, and no one could take it away. I drove back to Boston that evening and opened the family group chat to find a message from Rachel sent 2 hours earlier, all capital letters and excessive exclamation points, announcing, "Big news! We just submitted our offer on the Cape House with Mom and Dad co-signing. Fingers crossed, but the Realtor thinks we have a great shot. Can't wait to have family beach weekends." I stared at the message for a long moment, at the string of congratulatory replies from my parents and various aunts and uncles, and I typed carefully. "That's interesting. I'm sure the Realtor will be in touch soon," and turned off my phone, knowing that everything was about to change and feeling absolutely no regret. I waited 3 days before setting the plan in motion. 3 days of watching the family group chat fill with excited messages from Rachel about paint colors and furniture arrangements, and which weekends everyone would visit once they officially owned the beach house. And on Friday morning, I sent a message that made my mother immediately call me, confused and slightly suspicious, because I never offered to pay for family gatherings. "I'd love to treat everyone to lunch tomorrow," I'd written. "There's a restaurant near the Cape I've been wanting to try. It overlooks the water and I think you'd all love it, my treat." And when my mother called asking what the occasion was, I kept my voice light and said I'd just gotten a small bonus at work and wanted to do something nice, which was technically true since my quarterly stock had vested the previous week, adding another $87,000 to my portfolio. Rachel had responded in the group chat with, "Love it. We can drive by the house after lunch. I'm dying to show David the beach access path." And my father had sent a thumbs up emoji. And by Friday evening, it was settled that we'd all meet at the Harborview at noon on Saturday, a upscale seafood restaurant positioned perfectly 3 blocks from my new house, a house that now had fresh flowers in the living room, and my grandmother's quilt on the master bed, and my favorite books arranged on the built-in shelves. I drove to the Cape Saturday morning, arriving early to walk through the house one final time before everything changed. Standing on the deck with my coffee and watching the morning sun turn the ocean silver, and then I changed into a cream cashmere sweater and dark jeans, put on the pearl earrings again for luck, and drove to the restaurant where I'd made reservations for 5 under my name. They arrived within minutes of each other, my parents pulling up in their Lexus, just as Rachel and David parked their BMW, and I watched from my table by the window as they walked in together, Rachel wearing a flowing dress that probably cost $400, and David in the expensive casual style of someone trying to look successful, and my mother spotted me and waved, leading the group to the table where I stood to greet them with hugs that felt surreal given what was about to happen. Rachel immediately launched into decorating plans the moment we sat down, talking excitedly about how she was thinking coastal modern for the aesthetic, lots of whites and blues, maybe some weathered wood accents, and how she'd graciously let everyone visit, of course, but she'd need to establish some ground rules about peak summer weekends since those were prime rental opportunities if they decided to offset costs that way. My mother was nodding along enthusiastically, already claiming the bedroom on the second floor with the best morning light, saying she could spend entire weeks there in July, and my father was studying the menu while occasionally interjecting questions about the timeline, when they'd hear back about their offer, what the inspection might reveal. I sipped my wine slowly, a crisp Sancerre that cost $78 a bottle, and listened to them plan their future in my house, feeling strangely calm, almost detached, as though I were watching a play where I knew the ending, but they were still caught up in the second act. And when Rachel said, "Emma, you'll come visit too, obviously. I know you probably can't afford the trip often, but we'll make sure you have a spot." I smiled and said, "That's very thoughtful of you," and checked my watch. Knowing that Karen would be finishing her showing at a property 2 streets away and would likely stop by the restaurant just as we'd planned during our call yesterday. A call where I'd explained exactly what I needed, and she'd agreed with barely contained glee that she'd be happy to help. Karen walked through the restaurant door at 12:47 p.m., and I saw her before anyone else did, tracking her movement across the dining room as she scanned the tables with a leather portfolio tucked under her arm and her phone in her other hand, wearing a professional burgundy blazer and that confident smile of someone who'd just closed another successful deal. And when her eyes landed on me, her face lit up with genuine recognition, and she changed direction immediately, weaving between tables to approach ours, while my heart began to hammer so hard I was certain everyone could hear it. "Emma!" she said warmly as she reached our table, and I watched my family's heads turn toward her in confusion, their faces registering a polite interest in this stranger who seemed to know me, and Karen was still smiling as she said, "I thought that was you. What a wonderful surprise. I was supposed to meet clients here, but they just canceled on me. How are you settling into your beautiful new home?" The silence that fell over our table was so complete I could hear the ocean through the open windows and the clink of silverware from the neighboring table. And I met Karen's eyes and gave her the smallest nod, feeling the moment crystallize into something irreversible and perfect. My mother was the first to speak, her voice carrying that polite correction she used with service workers who made mistakes, saying, "I'm sorry, I think you might have my daughter confused with someone else." And she actually laughed a little as though the misunderstanding was charming, while Rachel had gone very still in her seat, and David was frowning at Karen like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve. Karen's smile never wavered as she looked at my mother and then back to me, her professional instincts clearly telling her something interesting was happening, even if she didn't fully understand what, and she said with perfect cheerful certainty, "No, it's definitely Emma. Emma Richardson, right? We closed on the property at 247 Ocean View Drive last Tuesday. I'd recognize my favorite client anywhere." And she shifted her portfolio to pull out a folder that I knew contained copies of all our paperwork, the closing documents with my signature on every page. My father's face had gone completely blank, that expression he got when processing information that didn't fit his understanding of the world. And Rachel's mouth had actually fallen open slightly, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips, and my mother was shaking her head with a confused smile like she was waiting for the punchline of a joke she didn't understand, saying, "That's the house we're buying. There must be some mistake. Our daughter couldn't possibly." And her voice trailed off as Karen opened the folder and pulled out the settlement statement, the one with my name printed clearly at the top above the property address and the purchase price of $2,800,000, and she held it so my mother could see it, her expression shifting from friendly to slightly concerned as she clearly began to realize she'd walked into some kind of family situation. "No mistake," Karen said gently. "Emma purchased the property outright. The sale was recorded with the county last week. It's all finalized and official." And she looked at me with a question in her eyes, silently asking if everything was all right, if she should stay or go, and I smiled at her with genuine warmth and said, "Thank you, Karen. It's so good to see you. Please don't let us keep you from your lunch," giving her permission to escape this increasingly tense situation. And she nodded slowly, tucked the documents back into her folder, squeezed my shoulder once in a gesture of solidarity, and said, "Congratulations again on your beautiful home, Emma. You've earned every bit of it," before walking toward the bar area where she could presumably get a table far away from whatever was about to unfold at ours. The moment Karen walked away, the chaos erupted like a wave that had been building offshore and finally crashed against the rocks. And Rachel was the first to break the silence with a voice that came out sharp and too loud, saying, "That's our house. There has to be a mistake. We put in an offer. We have pre-approval." And she was looking between my parents and David, as though they could somehow fix this impossible situation. And my mother was shaking her head slowly with her hand pressed against her chest, in that gesture she made when she was truly shocked, saying, "Emma, what is she talking about? You couldn't have. How could you possibly?" And the words died in her throat because even she couldn't quite articulate what she was trying to say, couldn't quite voice the assumption that I was too poor, too unsuccessful, too fundamentally incapable of achieving something like this. David was leaning forward with his elbows on the table, his face flushed red in a way that might have been anger or embarrassment or both, and he said, "How could you afford a $3 million house? What kind of job do you actually have?" And there was an accusatory tone in his voice, as though I'd committed some kind of fraud, as though the only explanation for my success was something criminal or dishonest. And I took a slow sip of my wine before setting the glass down with deliberate care and meeting each of their eyes in turn. "I bought it," I said simply, my voice calmer than I felt inside where my heart was racing, but my resolve was solid as stone. "I made an offer 3 weeks ago with full financial documentation. The sellers accepted. We closed last Tuesday. It's done. It's mine. It's been recorded with the county, and the deed is in my name." And I watched Rachel's face cycle through denial and confusion, and then land on anger, her eyes narrowing in a way that reminded me of every time she'd gotten something I wanted when we were children and had gloated about it with that same sharp expression. "You went behind our backs," Rachel hissed, her voice low enough that the neighboring tables couldn't hear, but venomous enough that I felt each word like a strike. "You knew we wanted that house. You knew we were planning to buy it, and you just stole it out from under us." And I felt something cold settle in my chest at the word stole, at the absolute audacity of her claiming ownership of something she'd never had any right to. And I shook my head slowly and said, "I didn't steal anything, Rachel. I made an offer on a property that was for sale on the open market, the same market where you were planning to make your offer. I just did it first, and I did it with better financing." And my father was staring at me like he'd never seen me before, his face caught somewhere between shock and what might have been the earliest edges of understanding, and he said, "Emma, this doesn't make any sense. Where did you get the money for this?" And my mother was nodding as though this was the key question, as though once we established the source of funds, everything else would make sense. And I looked at all four of them sitting there in their expensive clothes at this beautiful restaurant, having assumed for years that I was the family failure. And I said quietly, "I bought it the same way anyone buys a house. I had the money. I got approved for financing. I made an offer, like anyone else would." My father set down his water glass with a sharp click against the table and leaned forward with his jaw tight in that way that meant he was done accepting vague answers, and he said, "Emma, I want a real explanation right now. What exactly is your job and how much money do you actually make?" And his tone was the one he used to use when I was 16 and came home past curfew, that demand for accounting that felt less like concern and more like interrogation. And I looked at him steadily and said, "I'm a senior software engineer at a major tech company in San Francisco. I've been there for 4 years. My base salary is in the 400,000 range plus stock options and bonuses. I own my apartment outright, and I've been investing aggressively since I graduated college." And I watched the numbers land on them like physical blows, saw my mother's hand fly to her mouth and David's face go slack with shock, and Rachel's eyes narrow with something that looked like betrayal mixed with disbelief. "You're lying," Rachel said flatly, shaking her head as though she could deny reality into submission. "There's no way you make that much. You drive a 10-year-old car. You dress like," and she gestured at my simple cotton dress, as though it was evidence of poverty rather than choice. And I felt something sharp and clean cut through the years of hurt, and said, "I never lied, Rachel. Not once. I just never corrected your assumptions. You decided I was unsuccessful, and you never asked me a single question about my actual life." And my mother was shaking her head with tears starting to form in her eyes, saying, "But sweetheart, why wouldn't you tell us? Why would you let us think?" And I cut her off with a voice that was still calm, but harder now, saying, "Let you think what, Mom? Let you think I was a failure? I tried to tell you. I tried for years. Every time I got a promotion, I mentioned it, and you changed the subject to Rachel's latest Instagram campaign. Every time I tried to share something I'd accomplished, you either didn't hear me, or you minimized it, or you literally laughed." I could feel the attention of nearby tables on us now. could see a waiter hovering uncertainly near the kitchen doors, unsure whether to approach, and my father was rubbing his forehead like he had a headache building, saying, "That's not fair, Emma. We've always supported you." And I actually laughed then, a short, bitter sound that surprised even me, and said, "Dad, you paid for Rachel's entire college education, her wedding, her down payment on her first condo, you co-signed her car loan, and when I asked you to co-sign my student loans, you told me it would be good for me to learn financial responsibility on my own." I was 22 years old, working 2 jobs, and taking a full course load, and you gave Rachel a brand new car for her birthday that same year. The silence that followed was broken only by Rachel's sharp intake of breath, and I continued, because now that I'd started, I couldn't seem to stop, saying, "Do you remember 3 years ago at Christmas, when I mentioned I'd been promoted to senior engineer, and Mom said, 'That's nice, dear,' and then spent 40 minutes talking about Rachel's promotion to marketing manager at a company that pays half what mine does? Or 2 years ago when I tried to tell you about speaking at a tech conference, and Dad interrupted to ask Rachel about her vacation plans?" My mother was crying openly now, mascara starting to streak, and she said weakly, "We didn't realize. We thought you were just doing fine. We thought—" And I finished for her, saying, "You thought I was barely getting by because I didn't brag, because I didn't post my salary on social media, because I chose to live modestly and save my money instead of spending it on things to impress you. And when I said I wanted to buy the beach house, you laughed at me, Mom. You actually laughed and made a joke about studio apartments. And now you're upset because I did exactly what I said I would do." Rachel pushed back from the table so violently, her chair scraped against the floor with a sound that made everyone within 3 tables turn to look, and she stood there with her hands pressed flat against the tablecloth, her face flushed dark red and her voice shaking when she said, "You let us make fools of ourselves. You sat there for weeks listening to us plan and talk about buying that house, and you knew the whole time that you'd already bought it. You let us believe we had a chance, and you just played us." And I felt something cold and final settle in my chest as I looked up at her and said quietly, "I didn't play anyone, Rachel. You made assumptions and you made plans without ever asking me a single question. You made fools of yourselves without any help from me." And I watched her face contort with rage and hurt, and something that looked like the dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong about me for a very long time. My mother was crying harder now, saying through her tears, "Emma, please, you have to understand how this looks. You have to see that we're your family, and that house should be for all of us. You can't just keep it to yourself." And I felt the familiar pull of guilt that she'd been using on me my entire life, that suggestion that my boundaries were somehow selfish, that taking care of myself was the same as abandoning them. And I shook my head and said, "Mom, the house is mine. I bought it with my money. It's in my name. And no, you're not entitled to stay there. You're not entitled to summer bedrooms or holiday gatherings or any of it unless I invite you, which right now I'm not inclined to do." David was staring at me like I'd grown a second head, and he said, "This is crazy, Emma. Families don't treat each other like this. You don't just cut everyone out because of some perceived slight." And I laughed again, that same bitter sound, and said, "Perceived? David, you've been part of this family for 6 years, and you've never once asked me about my job, my life, anything beyond small talk. You've sat through dozens of dinners where my parents praised Rachel and ignored me, and you never once thought that was strange, so don't talk to me about how families treat each other." My father was very quiet now, his face pale and his hands folded on the table in front of him, and when he finally spoke his voice was low and tight with anger, saying, "I don't understand why you didn't tell us, Emma, if you were doing so well. If you had all this money and success, why would you keep it a secret? What possible reason could you have unless you wanted to punish us?" And I felt the unfairness of that question like a physical weight. Felt the way he was trying to make my self-protection into some kind of attack on them, and I leaned forward and said very clearly, "I'll answer that with a question, Dad. If I had told you 3 years ago that I was making $500,000 a year, would it have changed how you treated me? Or would it just have meant you started asking me for money the way Rachel has been hinting at for the last 2 years? The silence that followed was absolute and damning, and I could see in his face that he knew the answer, that they all knew the answer, and my mother said weakly, "That's not fair. We would never." But she couldn't finish the sentence, because we all knew it was a lie, because the truth was sitting there between us like something solid and undeniable, and Rachel sat back down heavily in her chair and said with venom, "So what? You're just going to cut us all off, keep your precious house and your money, and act like you don't have a family?" And I said calmly, "No, Rachel, I'm saying that I'm done being treated as less than. I'm done being dismissed and laughed at and having my achievements ignored. I'm done being the family disappointment when I was never the one who was disappointing. And if you want to have a relationship with me going forward, it's going to be on terms of mutual respect, or it's not going to be at all." I reached for my purse and pulled out my wallet, extracting my credit card and setting it on top of the check that our waiter had nervously placed at the edge of the table 10 minutes earlier. And I said quietly but clearly enough for everyone to hear, "I'm going to pay for lunch and then I'm going to leave, and I want you all to understand something before I go. I am offering you one chance, just one, to know me as I actually am, to respect my boundaries and treat me as an equal member of this family. And if you can do that, then I would be happy to have you in my life. But if you can't, if you need me to be small and unsuccessful to make yourselves feel better, if you need me to be the family disappointment so Rachel can be the golden child, then we can continue having a relationship as polite strangers who see each other at holidays and make small talk. But that's all it will ever be." My mother reached across the table toward me with tears streaming down her face and said, "Emma, please, don't do this. Don't cut us out over a misunderstanding." And I looked at her hand hovering in the air between us and said, "Mom, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is 32 years of being treated as less than, and I'm not cutting you out. I'm offering you a choice. You can have a real relationship with your daughter who is successful and capable and who bought a $2.8 million house with her own money, or you can keep the fantasy version you've preferred for decades. But you can't have both." Rachel was staring at the table with her jaw clenched and her hands twisted together so tightly her knuckles were white. And David looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. And my father met my eyes for a long moment before looking away with something that might have been shame crossing his face. I stood up and picked up my purse, and then I pulled out one of my new business cards, the ones I'd had made with my beach house address printed in elegant script, and I placed it in the center of the table and said, "That's my address, my real address now, the beach house in Cape Cod that you thought I could never afford. And if you want to reach me, if you want to actually try to build something real, you know where to find me. But I'm done chasing your approval, and I'm done making myself smaller so you can feel bigger." I walked out of that restaurant with my head high and my heart pounding, and I didn't look back to see if they were watching me leave. And when I got to my car, I sat in the driver's seat for 5 full minutes, with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, before I started the engine and drove the quarter-mile to my house. My beautiful house, with its weathered shingles and its view of the Atlantic and its rooms full of peace and possibility. 2 months passed. 2 months of silence from my family, except for a few awkward text messages from my mother that I answered politely but distantly. 2 months of me settling into my new life and my new home, working from the sun-filled office I'd set up in the room that overlooked the beach, taking morning walks along the shore, learning the rhythms of the tides and the calls of the seabirds, and slowly, carefully, letting myself believe that I had actually done it, that I had claimed this space and this peace for myself. I was sitting on my deck one Saturday morning in early October with my laptop balanced on my knees and a cup of coffee going cold beside me, working on a code review and half watching the waves roll in, when I heard a car pull into my driveway. And when I walked around to the front of the house, I saw my parents' sedan parked beside my old Honda, and my mother and father standing on my front walk looking uncertain and older somehow, smaller than I remembered them. My mother's eyes were red-rimmed, like she'd been crying recently or often, and my father's shoulders were hunched in a way that spoke of defeat. And when they saw me, my mother said, "Emma, we're so sorry to come by unannounced, but we were hoping you might have a few minutes to talk." And I looked at them standing there on my property, at my home that I had bought with my own success that they had dismissed. And I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite forgiveness, but maybe was the beginning of willingness. And I said, "Come in, we can talk." We sat in my living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows facing the ocean, and my mother couldn't stop looking around at the beautiful space with wonder and something that might have been regret. And my father sat very straight in the armchair with his hands on his knees and said, "Emma, we've spent the last 2 months thinking about what you said, really thinking about it, and we need you to know that we were wrong. We were so wrong about you and about how we treated you, and we're not here to make excuses, but we want to try to understand how to do better." The conversation that followed was long and painful and more honest than any we'd ever had, and I didn't make it easy for them because they didn't deserve easy. But I listened when my mother talked about how she'd projected her own fears and disappointments onto me, how she'd needed Rachel to be successful to validate her own choices. And I listened when my father admitted that he'd never known how to relate to me, that my quiet competence had somehow been harder for him to celebrate than Rachel's louder neediness. And slowly, carefully, we began to build something new on the ruins of what had been broken. Rachel didn't come that day or for many days after. And when I finally heard from her 3 months later, it was a short email that said simply, "I'm not ready to apologize, but I'm trying to understand." And I wrote back, "Take your time, I'm not going anywhere," because I had learned that I didn't need her approval or anyone else's to know my own worth. I stand now on my deck in the late afternoon with the sun setting over the water, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and I think about the girl I was who believed she needed her family's recognition to matter. And I think about the woman I've become who knows that her worth was never determined by whether they could see it. And I understand finally that this house is more than property, more than an investment, more than even a home. It's proof that I was always enough, that I was always capable, that I was always exactly who I needed to be. And as the last light fades from the sky and the stars begin to emerge above the Atlantic, I breathe in the salt air and feel the peace of finally being home, truly home, in a space I claimed for myself and in a self I no longer need permission to be.